So our first great speaker is Dr. Andrew Sutherland. So he's my colleague and he is a faculty and an extension agent in the Bay Area. He's very active in research and extension. He's a regular speaker at many different meetings and he has done research on termites, cockroaches, bed bugs, drywood termites, you name it. So I'm gonna let him to, expand the introduction, but he's a great resource for you, no matter where you are, but especially if you're in the Bay Area. Feel free to reach out to Andrew. And with that, Andrew, please start and welcome.
All right. Good morning to everyone. I'm happy to be here today. I really like the theme of today's webinar, troubleshooting problems. And really, if you think about it, pest management is about problem solving. Pests are problems. They are, by definition, causing some kind of problem. And so we have all kinds of different tools to manage and solve these problems. I'm going to focus in this initial presentation on inspection and monitoring. And we'll talk a lot about the differences between inspection and monitoring. And I hope to share with you guys a few examples of how I've used inspection and monitoring to solve problems in my own work. And so the theme here is Sherlock Holmes. So you see this, image depicting the fictional character Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes was very talented at observing and, really detecting things that other people did not detect. And so he often would tell Watson that it was about observation of trifles. You know, you're detecting tiny little things that other people are not trained or really paying attention to. If you'd like to learn more about who I am and my research programs in the San Francisco Bay Area, I've included this screenshot of my website. Um, I was the very first urban IPM advisor hired within the University of California system. And I include this mission statement here to describe what I do. A lot of people say, hey, what do you do anyway? I work with professionals to improve pest control through research and education in order to protect our communities and the environment. This is very meaningful to me. And I work with all kinds of different pests. Some people specialize on termites or ants or rodents, but I try to address the needs of my local clients, and those are the pest management professionals providing professional services in my region. So hopefully we can be in contact, especially if you're in my region here. So I'd like to frame this presentation within the process of integrated pest management. And urban integrated pest management is different from the traditional agricultural integrated pest management, or IPM. And but there are a lot of similarities as well. I would say that in agriculture, there's a big focus on economics, so the economic threat of the pest is what's driving the management. In urban systems, we have a lot of different kinds of pests. We may have public health pests that make us sick. We may have structural pests, which actually damage our structures and infrastructures. Or if you're working with the residential population, you know that there are nuisance pests. These are just pests that people do not want in their homes or around their homes. And so we have to use this process of IPM that was developed for a different system and apply it to these urban systems. And the way that I like to teach this is a step-by-step process. It begins with education. And so my example here is the Turkestan cockroach in the top left image. And so this is a cockroach that lives outside. It breeds outside. And we need to understand that in order to solve a problem where maybe the cockroaches are found indoors. How did they get in? They're not breeding in there. They're not really living in there. If you didn't understand the biology and ecology of this species, you would not be able to design an effective pest management program to keep them out. Next, we have prevention. So once we've learned about our particular target pest, how do we prevent this pest from becoming a problem? And so my example here is exclusion. We're using a copper wool to seal up the gap around a pipe penetration in a wall. And this can be somewhat effective against rodents, which may enter. Basically, you're making it a lot more difficult for them. They'll have to make another hole somewhere else. Once we have tried to prevent our pest from creating a problem, we have to have a monitoring program. And this is going to be the focus of today's presentation. Monitoring is a way that we get information about our pest system. And this information may include incidents. Is the pest even present? It may include population dynamics. Is the population increasing or decreasing? And we can actually use monitoring for evaluation as well. That's the final bullet here. But what that means is after our pest control program, are we still catching our target pest? Are we still observing signs of our target pest? Maybe our program was not that effective. Next, we have the concept of thresholds. And really, what this means is when do we take action? And with a lot of our urban pests, as soon as we have any evidence that the pest is present, we should do something. And that's because a lot of these are either public health or structurally damaging pests, or you don't want to lose your account. So even if it's a nuisance pest, you may be responding to very low thresholds of pest organisms. When we detect our pests, we use multiple tactics, and this is really a key central tenet of urban IPM, and that's because the I in IPM stands for integration, and you cannot integrate just one tactic. So if you are relying on pesticides, you're not using IPM. On the other hand, if you're relying on non-chemical tactics, maybe habitat manipulation or exclusion, that may not be considered IPM either. For IPM to be truly integrated, we need to have multiple tactics that are working together to drive the pest population down. And then, of course, the final piece here is evaluation. Did it work? Now, you may be looking at this list and saying, well, what about inspection? Where does inspection fit into all of this? Sometimes people put the inspection component up there with education. And oftentimes, inspection is the first step, the first boots on the ground step that you will take to solve a pest problem. But it really has more in common with the monitoring tenet, and I'll explain what that means. So, both inspection and monitoring are used to detect and also identify pests. So, we need to identify the target pest species in order to correctly and effectively implement pest management. We can also use both of these processes, inspection and monitoring, to tell us whether pests are present at levels that exceed our thresholds. In the case of something like a German cockroach or a bed bug, the threshold may be 1. We found 1 cockroach, we need to do something. In the case of Argentine ants around a structure, maybe the threshold is higher. Perhaps if they're not entering, we don't take the same steps that we would if the ants are entering and causing a problem in the break room, for instance. But inspection and monitoring are a little different. Inspection is really a snapshot, and it is active. It requires your presence. So an inspection, you guys are all very familiar with what this is. You're using your skills, your inspection tools to examine the site, the account, the property, whatever you're managing. And so that's where you have your Sherlock Holmes hat on and perhaps a magnifying glass or some other viewing device, and you're looking for signs of the pest. You're looking for the damage that the pest has caused. And then this is really important. You're looking for the conditions that are conducive to that pest. And so, if you are a good inspector, you are gleaning lots of valuable information actively. But again, this requires your boots on the ground. Monitoring, on the other hand, can be passive. The other difference with monitoring is it requires observation over a period of time. So you are recording some information over time so that you can see trends. Is the population going up or down? That's temporal trend. Are there more pests in one part of the facility than the other? That's a spatial trend. The other thing about monitoring is it can work for you when you're not at the site. So it's passive. It can also be proactive. So maybe you don't have a pest problem at your site, but you want to detect any potential problem as soon as possible. So you're being proactive. You are actually deploying some monitoring device before you have a problem. And so this is very forward thinking. One way to think about this is inspection is a one-time occurrence, whereas monitoring is more like a series of inspections. So again, inspection, I think, is very familiar to you guys. You're looking for damage, you're looking for signs of the pest, you're looking for these conducive conditions, and you're using all of the tools, that physical tools as well as some experiential tools that you have gained. So you might be using a flashlight or a headlamp to look into dark areas where the pests may be. You should be using a camera to record what you see, maybe a notepad to draw a diagram of the structure you're inspecting and record your observations. But it's really important that you're using your senses, especially your eyes, but you may be using your nose. You can actually smell certain pests, cockroaches, bed bugs, rodents, and from your experience, you will learn what that smell is. Your brain will be conditioned to detect that pest by smell. And then there may be uh, advanced detection equipment that you use for certain pests. Sometimes when I'm working with termite operators, we're using moisture meters, infrared thermometers to try to look behind wall coverings for where pests may be present. This could be effective for rodents as well. So in my photo here, this is somebody's pantry, and you see damage. So some of the food packages have been opened and food has been scattered around. You see signs, so there are actually feces from a rodent here. And I would argue that I see conducive conditions. So improperly stored food, in packages that can be easily opened and damaged by these rodents. Here's another example. These are drywood termite pellets, which are visible within kick-out holes that lead to a gallery of drywood termites beneath these floorboards. And so here again, you see the damage, you see the signs, and the conducive conditions may not be obvious in this photo, but you're able to kind of look at the whole system and use your experience to understand what's the path forward. Sometimes your inspection will reveal the pest organism itself. And if I'm doing an inspection, I'm looking for the pest that's been reported, but I'm also looking for other things. And so if you're inside, don't forget to look on windowsills. A lot of insects are attracted to light or they're trying to disperse towards light, and windowsills can be a great place, kind of like a monitor that's built into a structure where flying insects are attracted and eventually die. They desiccate. And so in this case, these are adult carpet beetles, and they may have emerged from somewhere inside this home, but they've died on the windowsill. And so that's a really important clue for a potential infestation. My daughter's really good at inspection. And like I say, inspection sometimes reveals pest organisms. So she was walking around the outside of the home and she said, there's a cockroach stuck. And sure enough, this is a female Turkestan cockroach, which is stuck in this crawl space vent cover. And so um, she has the eyes of a 5-year-old. She's constantly looking for movement and little things. And I learn a lot from her about how to do inspections, really just to be aware of everything that's going on. Another Turkestan cockroach situation. So we mentioned that insects may fly or disperse towards light. So this is a case that I observed last year in the fall, and there was an insect visible inside this light shade, this drum shade that's covering a ceiling light. And so I removed the light shade, and there was another female Turkestan cockroach that had died inside this light shade. How did she get in there? The light shade was very firmly attached to the ceiling. There were no gaps. And it would have been very difficult for the cockroach to climb across the ceiling, down the slippery fixture, and up the slippery shade to get inside. So the most logical explanation is that this cockroach entered from the mounting hole where the screw penetrates into the ceiling, from the ceiling void. And so this actually is rather common where you have insects that may be infesting a crawl space, a sub area. They're able to access wall voids, and those wall voids let them access a ceiling void. Once they're in the ceiling void, the little bits of light that are present are going to be very attractive if they're trying to disperse out of that location. And so this is a an indication that we have Turkestan cockroaches present. There may not be a pest problem in this case, but it lets us know that hey, Turkestan cockroaches are moving around in the structural void spaces. Another example where we're using light shades. This was a recent inspection, again, October or November, that I did here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And a resident was complaining, this was in an apartment complex, of moths flying around inside their unit. And so the pest control operator initially thought they were dealing with clothes moths, and they deployed some monitoring device for clothes moths. Then they thought, okay, this might be Indian meal moth. So there was never really a good identification made. But when I went to the site to help them, we saw this here, this light shade filled with moths or filled with something. We opened up that light shade and were able to see that, in fact, these were probably the moths that the resident was seeing. Um, an identification revealed that these were not clothes moths. These were pyralid stored product moths. Um, in this case, we think we're dealing with a species of Festiones, sometimes known as the dusky raisin moth. And so these larvae, the caterpillars of these moths, feed on dried fruit, nuts, other decomposing dried food. And so, how did they get in to this light shade? Again, ostensibly, they're coming from the ceiling void. Well, how did they get in the ceiling void? We opened up an attic hatch and we saw lots of rat feces up there. And the rats were basically living in the insulation and tunneling throughout the insulation in this attic space. And they had been bringing in ornamental plums from the landscape and stashing them up there in that attic space. And so this created a food source for these moths, and there was a large population of the moths developing. And so you see here, we started with, the moth is the problem. Maybe it's clothes moth. We used our inspection skills to detect the pest organism, identify the pest organism, and expand our search based on that. The pest solution in this case was uh, rodent exclusion. And in this case, they actually removed all of the insulation in this attic space so they could properly exclude the rats. And this was also effective at removing the food source for these moths. So, inspection a lot of times will lead you to a solution that you did not conceive of originally. When we were first called to this case, we weren't thinking about rats and we weren't thinking about the ceiling void. So, again, inspection is a snapshot, it's a one-time occurrence, and we're using all of the skills and training that we have acquired. But monitoring can be passive. We can be working on monitoring when we're not at the site. And you can think of it again as a series of inspections that gives you information about trends, whether those are temporal or spatial. So this is a common site. This is a government building where I spend some time, and you'll see, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor or not, but here are some exterior double doors with huge gaps, between the doors as well as under the doors. And you've got two glue traps that have been placed here next to the exterior doors by the pest control operator. But if you look closely, you will see that these glue traps are not being replaced. All right. So they're really being used as physical control measures. Nobody is changing these traps out. Nobody is recording the data. And so the question is this monitoring? It seems like maybe there was a problem. Maybe Oriental or Turkestan cockroaches are entering from these exterior doors. And these monitors could be used to inform us about which doors are problematic, which months of the year are we seeing this problem occur. But instead, what the customer sees is a glue board full of insects that's breaking down over time. You see, they're even coming undone in some cases, not being replaced, and the data is not being recorded. On the other hand, this could be monitoring if we were switching out the traps, let's say monthly or biweekly, and recording the data. And you see, this shows us what season of the year we might be experiencing cockroach invasion. It can also tell us if we compare the north doors to the south doors to, other doors in the facility where the cockroaches are getting in. So I would argue that we need to improve our glue trap practices. We need to be recording those data and switching out the traps regularly. So monitoring can also detect pest organisms. Think of monitoring as almost like an enhanced inspection. Sometimes we suspect a pest. This is really common with termites, where they're cryptic, they're hidden in the soil, they may be hidden behind wall coverings. How do we detect them in order to move forward with our management? There are wooden monitoring devices out there that we can put in the ground, and we can record damage, but also we can collect target pests, and that can be useful for it's absolutely useful for confirming this target pest. This is also important with bed bugs. So you see a monitoring device on the bottom right here. It's a pitfall interceptor, commonly used for bed bugs. And a lot of times, bed bugs are difficult to find during an inspection. They may be harboring within a deep crevice. It's not always going to be the mattress seam or the bed itself where they're harboring. And so you may not see them during your inspection, even if you spend a lot of time and use a lot of skills. So the monitor actually extends your inspection. It enhances your inspection, something you can leave there at the site and return later after some time. And you may have a target pest present. Monitoring can help you to confirm the target pest. This is one example where my research team used monitoring to detect bed bugs in multi-unit housing. And a lot of times our bed bug programs are driven by complaints. So in that case, you're reliant upon the resident to come to management or come to pest control and say, hey, I'm getting bitten. But we wanted to find out what's the actual incidence rate of bed bugs at these sites. We were looking at three different sites. And so we put in one um, pitfall monitor per bedroom in every unit of the apartment complexes, regardless of whether or not they were complaining of bed bugs. And we were surprised. The researchers were not that surprised, but the pest control and the management was extremely surprised because they thought they understood there were three or four problem units in their complex, but in fact, in some cases, we detected bed bugs in up to 50% of these apartment complexes. And so monitoring really helps you to confirm the pest, identify the pest, and understand the scope of the problem. So if you think there's only three units that are infested, your program may look very different than if you realize that half of the units in the complex actually have bed bugs. We can also use monitoring to document population dynamics over a season. And this ties into the idea of thresholds. And the example here is yellow jacket wasps. So there's a lot of research from the 1980s and 90s documenting that once we have too many wasps, it's likely people will get stung, out there at the park or the swimming pool when they're having their picnic. And so that number, that threshold, has been estimated at 10 wasps per day per trap, using these heptobutyrate lure traps. And so if we are using these traps throughout the season, we can see that the numbers are increasing, and we can see when the numbers actually surpass our threshold and make it very likely that somebody at the site is going to get stung. So that would be a moment when we shift our program from monitoring to control, and we would be actively seeking out nests in order to make nest treatments or utilizing a bait if it were available. Let's see. So, and I've mentioned this before, but we can also use monitoring to evaluate our program. So it's a kind of quality control. You've been working at a facility or a site. How do you know that your program is working? Are the pests still present after everything that you've done? Are the numbers perhaps decreasing? And so we just need to give it more time. Uh, if we are monitoring over multiple years, we may know that certain seasons are associated, let's say, with occasional invaders that come in, let's say, in the fall. So maybe we institute some exclusion practices in summer, and then our monitors will tell us, did those exclusion tactics work to keep our seasonal occasional invaders out? And so in this example, we're looking at German cockroaches. And German cockroaches can be trapped quite easily if you know where to put your monitoring device. And this is a great way to know if your baiting program or your exclusion program is effective. So again, talking about German cockroaches, here's an example where, again, my research team working in multi-unit housing was instituting an IPM program at a facility. And the IPM program included some education, some exclusion, and a lot of gel bait, targeting these German cockroaches. And we were able to show that the program was effective over 1 year by just using a single glue trap placed between the refrigerator and the cabinet where the sink was for 2 weeks. And so over time, we showed that both the incidence, but especially the density of cockroaches per unit was decreased. And so this is based on a knowledge of the biology of this species. Where do they live? Where can we find them? Where can we deploy our monitoring device? Speaking of monitoring devices, they should be selected based on your target pest's biology, ecology, and behavior. So certain pests like cockroaches can easily be trapped with glue boards, for instance, while others like bed bugs may be reluctant to step onto that sticky surface. And so unless you have a very large population, you may not catch bed bugs on glue traps. Instead, we may use a passive monitoring device like a Harbridge trap. The lower left shows a simple cardboard Harbridge trap for bed bugs. It just creates some little channels, some little holes that bed bugs will like to harbor within. And so these passive devices, and glue traps are actually passive devices as well. They exploit the natural behavior of the pest. In the case of the cockroach, they are running around or walking around, but they are following corners and edges. And so we may place these devices in contact with the wall or corner, trying to really trap those cockroaches as they're traversing those areas. And then, as I mentioned, the bed bugs are trying to harbor within crevices. So we can create some crevices that we can later inspect. So let's move on to a different cockroach species. We've already talked about this one a little bit. Turkestan cockroach. Again, they don't live inside like German cockroach. They're harboring usually in outdoor crevices, like this pavement crevice, which leads to a void space. And what happens is at night, when they're foraging around, they can enter our buildings, especially under exterior doors that are poorly sealed. So you see in this image here, I caught several in the act of going right underneath these exterior doors. And so this was a project Sivash worked on with me where we were trying to eliminate a large cockroach population from a public school. And so we instituted an IPM program, which included exclusion, habitat modification. So we tried to seal those exterior doors. We tried to eliminate the landscape crevices where the cockroaches were living. We raised these trash cans on pedestals so that the cockroaches could not hide underneath. And then we applied large amounts of cockroach gel bait that was labeled for outdoor use. But how did we know if our program was working? In this case, we used glue boards that were placed outside. And this is a practice which we have to be very careful about so that we do not catch non-target animals. And it may not be practical in most pest control settings, but what we did is we set these glue traps around sunset. This was a public school, so we had access overnight. And then we returned before sunrise to retrieve these traps before students showed up and before diurnal animals started walking around. And so you can see this image on the left. This is the before implementation of IPM, where we have all of these cockroaches potentially entering an exterior door. This is how many cockroaches were trapped right next to an exterior door of a school building. And after our IPM program was instituted, and there were 4 different bait events, we were able to drive that population close to zero. And so our monitoring showed us that our program was effective. So passive monitoring devices could include camera traps. And so I don't work often with rodents, but I'm starting to work more and more with rodents. And these wildlife cameras or camera traps can be really effective to show us where the animals are moving, how they're responding to our traps or bait stations that we have set up. In this example, this was a roof rat in my garage, and I wasn't able to catch this rat until I moved the trap to a vertical post. So actually, the post that's kind of hidden by that plastic kayak in this video, I affixed the trap to this post and was able to catch the rat. And the video showed me where the rat was walking usually and how it responded to the trap that I had on the ground. So we can also use what we call active monitoring devices. These are devices that utilize some kind of attractant. It may be a food source for your target pest. It may be light. So we mentioned that a lot of flying insects are attracted to light. And so think of your ultraviolet fly light traps. We may use heat. There's a bed bug trap out there that includes a heat source as well as a small scale carbon dioxide emission. And these are both attractants for that blood feeding pest. Or we may use pheromones. And so pheromones are especially useful against moths. These moths are flying around. They may only live for a few days, and they're looking to fall in love and make love. So we can utilize that behavior, or we can exploit that behavior and use a female sex pheromone to attract male moths and monitor that population. So here's a curveball question. What about bedbug interceptors? Are these active or passive? They're just hard plastic, slippery plastic, which is sometimes installed underneath a furniture leg or bed leg. And the idea is that the bedbug climbs in and gets stuck, can't climb out, they can't jump or fly. And so you could consider this passive, except there's people present. If there are people present, sleeping in this bed, resting in this furniture, they are providing heat, CO2, and in fact, you have created an active monitoring situation. So I mentioned fly lights. I love to see people utilizing fly lights, but just like the glue traps I showed earlier in this presentation, we need to be checking the sticky surface in there, identifying the pest species that are present, and maybe tracking the population over time. This was a pest situation at a hospital. I was helping out in San Jose at this hospital, and they reported a fly problem. The first thing I asked, what species? And they weren't quite sure. And so, looking at this fly light adhesive surface, we were able to identify two different flies that were present. And then, learning about the biology of these flies, we were able to design a pest management program that excluded and managed them. So the little housefly, Phania, is an outdoor species. It's breeding in decaying vegetation or animal manure, and it was not reproducing within the hospital. So that was an exclusion strategy using air curtains, um, increased trapping near exterior doors, some changes in behavior for the people that were working at this facility, not leaving doors open, for instance. But then there was another fly species present, and this was a humpbacked phorid fly. And so these flies are a type of organic slime breeding fly. So they may be present in drains, but they also may be present underneath tile in bathrooms. They may be associated with food preparation. Um, so they're eating decomposing organic sludge. And in this case, they were breeding inside the garbage chute of the hospital. And so once we identified that fly species, we were able to pinpoint the larval breeding site and eliminate that population. Keep in mind that pheromones, if we're using pheromone traps as active monitors, they are very pest specific. Sometimes your pheromone trap will only attract one species, and so you really have to know your target species before you deploy something like this. These two traps look identical, but they utilize different pheromones. The clothes moth trap is only going to attract a couple of genera within the Teniidae clothes moths, whereas the trap on the right is designed to attract Indian meal moths. So that's a single species in a different moth family. And so this goes back to the example of the dusky raisin moth that were breeding up in the ceiling void. The pest control operator in that case had deployed a bunch of clothes moth pheromone lures, traps. Didn't catch anything because they didn't have clothes moths. And that was really the reason I was brought in was, hey, we're trapping for clothes moths. Why aren't we catching anything? We didn't identify the species. Here's another case study where we're using monitoring devices to collect specimens of our pest species and use those specimens as vouchers and in order to evaluate our program. So this is a case where we were baiting for Reticulotermes subterranean termites, and we utilized a wood monitoring station right next to our bait station. So here's the bait station. Here's our wood monitoring stake that we installed in contact with our bait stations. And we could check these monitoring stations without bothering our baits. And in some cases, we were collecting termites from these wood stakes. We could preserve those in ethanol, and we could actually extract and analyze the DNA within those termites. And that was helpful for determining, is this our initial colony that we tried to manage, or is this a secondary colony that has moved in to attack this home? So I'll show you what that looks like. This is a home in San Jose. We had these bait and monitoring stations installed as a perimeter around the structure. And so in this case, our program started with a hit on station number 4. We were able to collect termite specimens and called them Colony A. That was the first colony that we collected at this site. Well, just 6 months later, there were no termites present, and we concluded that we perhaps had eliminated Colony A. We were no longer finding Colony A. A year after that, however, we started to get more hits on this side, the same side of the house. And so the question was, did our program fail? But in fact, we were able to collect termites and verify that this was a different colony that was moving in to occupy those tunnels that had been abandoned by Colony A and to actually access the same food resources that had been abandoned by Colony A. And then, of course, 1 year after that, we concluded that we may have eliminated Colony B. So this showed the operator and the resident that we were protecting the home over time against successive invasions of Reticulotermes termites. The final case study I want to discuss here is one in which we have to utilize passive and active monitoring tactics. This is the case of biting mites. Tropical rat mites are the target here. And these are blood-feeding mites that can bite humans, especially if their primary host, the rat in this case, has been removed or eliminated from the site. They will wander and feed on people, and this can cause severe dermatitis. Um, this is a secondary pest problem. The primary pest problem in this case is the nesting rats, or in some cases, nesting birds. And this is a really tricky pest situation because the mites are small, they're difficult to catch, they're difficult to identify. So sometimes you will think you're dealing with a case of delusory infestation, where you think, okay, this resident has a delusion because I'm not catching any bed bugs, I'm not catching any mosquitoes, I'm not catching any fleas. But in fact, there is a biting pest present, and we just need an effective monitoring device. Um, so I'm showcasing this website on the bottom right, birdmites.org. So this is just one example of some misinformation that may be out there, and it documents the connection between delusory infestation and these small biting mites. Um, a lot of times people either have real problems with mites and they are considered to have a delusion, or people that are suffering from delusory infestation are desperate for an explanation to their symptoms, and they find their way to websites like this. So, in the case of biting mites, what we have learned is their behavior informs monitoring. So, they exhibit what's called negative phototaxis. That means they move away from light. They exhibit positive thigmotaxis. That means they like tight crevices, just like bed bugs do. And this is really interesting. They exhibit negative geotaxis. That means they climb up. So if you install a glue board on the ground, you're not likely to catch these mites because they're actually climbing up. We observed them often to climb up walls and across ceilings. And we've heard from pest control operators as well as people suffering from these mites that they actually drop onto them. So somebody might be in their bed scrolling on their phone trying to fall asleep, and that's when they would observe the mites falling onto the lit surface of their phone. And so we wanted to utilize this behavior that we have documented in our monitoring scheme. We also considered that this is a blood-feeding pest. It may be attracted to stimuli produced by the host, CO2 and heat, which are both produced by vertebrate warm-blooded hosts. So we instituted a experimental monitoring project where we utilized glue traps and we tried to include attractants such as heat and carbon dioxide. And in fact, we saw exactly what was being reported by um, our clients is that when we installed our glue traps on a horizontal surface, the mites were found in the center of the glue trap. So if they were crawling onto this glue trap, you would expect to find them on the edge. But in fact, with our horizontal placements, we found them in the middle, which does suggest that the mites are falling from a surface above. But, basically we started using vertical placements. We compared the vertical placements of our monitors to our horizontal placements, and we also utilized heat and carbon dioxide to trap mites. And in fact, we did see that our vertical placements were more successful, and utilization of heat and carbon dioxide were more successful at catching mites. This was a public school setting in San Francisco. And so this is experimental. I don't know that there are traps out there that utilize heat and carbon dioxide that we can use for mites. But what I invite you guys to do if you think you're dealing with biting mites is just move your glue boards from the floor to the wall and maybe put them in a corner or put them at the top of the wall where the wall meets with the ceiling. Also, you can use painter's tape to make sure that there are no gaps underneath that trap. These mites are looking for tight crevices and they can go right underneath your glue traps and they will not get caught. Um, all of the videos that are describing this work are found on YouTube in the UCANR YouTube channel. So to summarize, inspection and monitoring are related. These give us information and help us solve pest problems. Um, and so we want to train ourselves to really observe with a keen eye. We are observing those trifles, those tiny things that other people don't notice. We're looking for patterns. We're looking for novelty, so something that's out of place. And then most importantly, I hope that we start to use our monitoring data to make treatment decisions. And in order to do that, we have to be switching out our monitoring devices and recording the data so that we can detect trends. You can read more about all of these research projects by signing up for UC IPM's Green Bulletin newsletter. And I'm going to end there. Thank you, and I'm sorry for going over time.